Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to all of our guests for today's testimony. In our mutual goals of reducing emissions, and especially from the Science Committee, I think it's important that we remain goal-oriented. I think we need to remain anchored to data. And so, Ms. Barrett, in that regard, and especially from an international perspective, I just had a few questions. One, in terms of the macro global look, what is the current percentage of CO2 within our current Earth's atmosphere? You mentioned in your report that it's the highest concentration in over 2 million years. What is that concentration?
I'll have to get back to you with the exact numbers on that. If you'd like the current, or are you talking about in our most recent report?
Yeah, I think it's important for us to have the perspective over time, so we can see rate of change and rate of change as well. And then in terms of contributors to this challenge, which nations are sort of the top 3 or 4 contributors to CO2 emissions?
So if you look kind of at cumulative emissions, the U.S. is at the top of that list.
No, I mean today, actual burn rate of emissions, real time.
Yeah, so for the last decade, at the top of that list has been China.
How do they compare relative to the United States in terms of either CO2 emissions by ton or, I guess by ton is probably the right metric, right?
Yeah, I don't have those figures just with me right now, and I'd be happy to get it to you. But I can say that if you look at the trends over the recent decades, the U.S. Trend has been to decrease the rate of growth over these decades, while China is increasing.
Yeah, and that's the problem. And I actually have those figures for your reference. China represents about 30% of CO2 emissions on the planet, which is about 10 billion tons, which is about twice as much as the United States at about 5 billion tons. 5 billion with a B. And so in your written testimony, you have a statement that says we have to stay within the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming trend. If it goes above that, that's effectively a breaking point. And you said that in order to achieve that, the global greenhouse gas emissions need to peak before 2025 at the latest and be reduced in aggregate by 43% from 2019 to 2030. And if what you said is true, which is that China is not actually decreasing its emissions, we have a bit of a math problem here. If they're emitting 10 billion tons a year and we're emitting 5 billion tons a year, that adds up to 15 billion tons, and a 43% reduction would yield about 8.55 billion tons, which means that between the two countries, if we kept this 2-to-1 ratio, we would need to be roughly about 3 billion tons of emissions, which is more than our fair share if China is not reducing. So my question goes to how do we fix this math problem? From an international perspective, we have now allocated $8 billion of U.S. taxpayer money to this UN climate fund. You say words like equity and inclusion, but my understanding is that the money that's going to China through this UN climate fund vehicle is actually going to the Xinjiang province, where we're currently witnessing one of the most brutal genocides in the history of our planet since World War II, with the Uyghur genocide, where we're investing in China or giving money, American taxpayer dollars, to China to build effectively clean energy. That's the intent. I don't think we have any reporting mechanisms. So my question to you, from an international perspective, in your position as the Vice Chair of IPCC, with the responsibilities that you have, besides compelling Americans on how to reduce our emissions, how do we do that for China? And how do we avoid sending precious American taxpayer dollars to the Chinese Communist government and other bad actors in an effort to get to lower emissions and ensure that they're actually spending it on the right projects?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's a good one. But I'll just note, as a science body, the IPCC doesn't make individual recommendations for any country, including for the U.S. But what we do is to highlight that this is a global challenge, as you were pointing out, and it requires a global solution. The level of effort that's required to turn the tide on emissions reductions is heavy, it's big, and all countries will need to play their part. I am certainly, I hope I haven't indicated in my testimony, either oral or written, that this is a U.S. problem to solve. This is a global problem for us to tackle together.
I understand that. I'm out of time, but I'm just very frustrated that we have no solutions to compel China besides throwing more taxpayer money at it. I yield back, Madam Chair.